There are names in history that still cause silence, even decades later. Names that bring a chill, not only because of the crimes attached to them, but because of the way those crimes were committed, methodically, scientifically, and with a chilling calm. One of those names is Josef Mengele, the man history remembers as the Angel of Death. But before he became a symbol of cruelty, he was something else: a child, a student, a doctor in training, and a man who seemed, at first, to pursue the path of science and medicine. To understand Mengele's story, we must step back into Germany in the early 20th century, a nation wounded by defeat in World War I, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, and searching desperately for direction. Born on March 16, 1911, in Günzburg, Bavaria, Josef Mengele came into the world in a wealthy family. His father ran a successful agricultural machinery business, and young Joseph grew up with privilege, education, and opportunity. He was not the stereotypical monster from the start. He was intelligent, curious, ambitious. Teachers described him as bright, polite, and eager to learn. From a very young age, Mengele had an interest in science, particularly biology and anthropology. He studied medicine and philosophy in Munich, and later anthropology in Vienna. His professors saw him as a promising academic mind. In fact, in 1935, he earned a doctorate in anthropology, focusing his research on the structure of the lower jaw. Later, in 1938, he completed a second doctorate in medicine. This was not an uneducated fanatic. This was a man of science, trained at some of the best institutions in Germany. But Germany in the 1930s was no ordinary place. It was a society poisoned by ideology, swept by nationalism, and increasingly defined by racial theories that classified human beings into hierarchies. Josef Mengele's academic path intersected with these ideas at a dangerous moment. He became an assistant to Ottmar von Verschuer, a prominent scientist in genetics and twin studies. It was this connection, this fascination with heredity and racial biology, that would later shape the direction of his infamy. In 1937, Mengele joined the Nazi Party, and by 1938, he was also a member of the SS. For someone ambitious, this was not unusual. For many young German men, joining the party was a path to career advancement. But for Mengele, it was also an alignment of science with ideology, a belief that racial biology could be used not just as an academic discipline, but as a tool for the future of Germany. As war exploded in 1939, Mengele served as a doctor with the Waffen-SS. He was even decorated for bravery after being injured at the Eastern Front. For a time, he was not in the spotlight, just another soldier doctor in Hitler's war machine. But fate, and his scientific background, would take him somewhere far darker. By 1943, Josef Mengele received a new assignment. He was sent to a place whose very name would later echo as one of history's darkest chapters, Auschwitz-Birkenau. When he arrived, he stepped into a world of barbed wire, gas chambers, and systematic extermination. It was here, in the machinery of the Holocaust, that Mengele's ambition, his scientific curiosity, and his allegiance to Nazi ideology fused into something terrifying. Mengele quickly became known for his presence on the selection ramp. When trains arrived packed with men, women, and children deported from across Europe, Mengele stood there, impeccably dressed in his SS uniform, calmly directing people to the right or to the left, to life or to death. Survivors remembered the terrifying image of this doctor, casually flicking his hand, sending thousands to their fate with a gesture. But this was only the beginning. Mengele was not content to simply be part of the machinery of extermination. He brought with him a desire to experiment, to research, to use Auschwitz as a laboratory. His focus on twins, influenced by his earlier mentor, now turned into a cruel obsession. He saw in Auschwitz the opportunity to study heredity by comparing twins, something impossible under normal conditions. But in the camp, He had endless subjects. For now, this is where our story pauses. Josef Mengele, once a bright student from Bavaria, had now become a doctor standing at the gates of Auschwitz. The world was about to discover what happens when science is stripped of humanity and ambition is fused with ideology. In the next part, we will step into the selections, the experiments, and the chilling transformation of a doctor into the angel of death. The train whistle pierced the silence as another convoy of cattle cars screeched to a halt at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Inside those cars, hundreds of men, women, and children had endured days of suffocation, thirst, and terror. When the doors finally slid open, the prisoners were blinded by floodlights, shoved out by guards, and met with barking dogs. This was the moment that determined everything, the moment of selection. Standing on the platform was Josef Mengele. Survivors remembered him as a striking figure, tall, handsome, and impeccably groomed, his SS uniform spotless, his boots polished to a shine. But what they remembered most was his hand. With a single flick, right, left, he decided the fate of each person. Those sent to the right were marched into the camp to forced labor. Those sent to the left walked unknowingly toward the gas chambers. In seconds, lives ended or extended, determined not by justice, not by chance, but by the casual gesture of a doctor who smiled as he worked. Many survivors spoke of the surreal cruelty of his demeanor. Unlike other officers, Mengele sometimes whistled operatic tunes as he made selections, his face calm, almost pleasant. But that mask of charm only made his role more terrifying. One survivor later said, "It was the smile that killed us." He smiled, and with that smile, he sent my mother to her death. The selections were not only about extermination, they also fed Mengele's hunger for research. He was particularly interested in twins. When he spotted identical siblings stepping off a train, he would pause, eyes lighting up, and personally escort them aside. Mothers holding the hands of twins were sometimes spared temporarily, but only so their children could be taken. The twins became known in Auschwitz as Mengele's children. They were housed together in special barracks, separated from the general prisoner population. At first glance, they received better treatment, more food, cleaner clothes, medical attention. To the terrified children, it seemed like a miracle. But that illusion soon shattered. They were not being cared for. They were being prepared. Mengele's obsession with twins was rooted in his desire to understand heredity and genetics. He believed that by studying identical siblings, he could unlock the secrets of racial purity and reproduction. Auschwitz gave him access to hundreds of pairs, something no laboratory in the world could provide. And so, he began his experiments. Children were measured endlessly. The size of their heads, the distance between their eyes, the shape of their noses. Their blood was drawn repeatedly, often in large amounts. They were subjected to painful injections of unknown substances. Sometimes one twin would be deliberately infected with a disease, while the other was kept healthy so the doctor could compare the progress. Survivors described the fear of being summoned by Mengele. He often arrived in the children's barracks in a good mood, handing out candy or smiling warmly as he patted them on the head. Then, without warning, he ordered them to the laboratory. The same man who gave them sweets in the morning might inject them with poison in the afternoon. Some of the experiments defied comprehension. He attempted crude surgeries without anesthesia, transfused blood from one twin to another, and even tried to artificially change eye color by injecting chemicals directly into the iris. The procedures left children screaming, blind, or permanently scarred. Perhaps most horrifying was what happened when one twin died. Mengele would immediately order the other twin killed, so their bodies could be dissected and compared. To him, their humanity was irrelevant. They were specimens, data points in his quest for knowledge twisted by ideology. And yet, among the terror, there was confusion. Some children, too young to understand, still felt affection for the man in the white coat who smiled at them, who sometimes saved them from the gas chamber. One survivor later recalled, "We called him Uncle Mengele. We didn't know. We were just children." For the prisoners who witnessed these selections, the memory never left. The sight of Mengele casually raising his hand, condemning entire families in seconds, embodied the cold efficiency of the Holocaust. His medical degree, his education, his charm, none of it humanized him. On the contrary, it gave him the tools to kill not in anger or rage, but with the detachment of a scientist at work. By 1944, as deportations from Hungary swelled the camp's population, the selections reached their peak. Mengele was everywhere on the ramp, watching, choosing, collecting his research subjects. His reputation spread among the prisoners. Some whispered about the angel of death, the doctor whose touch determined life or death. But even as his crimes escalated, Mengele saw himself not as a murderer, but as a man of science. To him, Auschwitz was not only a killing factory, it was his laboratory, his chance to leave a legacy in the world of genetics. He believed his name would be remembered in the halls of medicine. And indeed, it would, but for reasons darker than he ever imagined. In the next part, we will step inside the so-called laboratories of Auschwitz to see the reality of Mengele's experiments, the cruelty disguised as science, the suffering endured by children, and the shocking details that survivors carried with them for the rest of their lives. The barracks of Auschwitz were unlike anything most prisoners had ever seen before. Long, narrow wooden structures with rows of bunks stacked 3 levels high. The buildings were originally designed to house animals, not people. Yet here, human beings were crammed into spaces that stripped away dignity, privacy, and health. Up to 700 souls might be forced into a single barrack meant for a fraction of that number. The stench of sweat, illness, and despair clung to the air. Every detail inside these barracks was a reminder that the system was designed to break both body and spirit. Prisoners were given straw-stuffed sacks for bedding, though many had nothing at all. Lice and fleas spread rapidly, making sleep nearly impossible. Thin blankets, shared by several, did little to keep away the freezing cold in winter. In the summer, suffocating heat pressed down on the crowded bodies. Food was scarce, a deliberate policy meant to weaken the prisoners slowly. A watery broth called soup, sometimes nothing more than hot water with a hint of vegetable, was handed out once a day. Bread rations were so small they could vanish in 2 bites. Malnutrition hollowed out faces, weakened muscles, and left people vulnerable to disease. For many, starvation was not just a side effect of camp life, it was part of the killing mechanism. But among these unbearable conditions, Mengele moved with a kind of chilling detachment. To him, the barracks were not simply holding cells for the unwanted. They were laboratories of living subjects. The twins, the dwarfs, the pregnant women, those selected by his hand at the train ramp, were often sent to live in separate quarters. Unlike the majority of prisoners, they sometimes received extra rations and cleaner bedding, not out of compassion, but because Mengele wanted them healthy enough to endure his experiments. Inside those special sections, a cruel paradox unfolded. Children who had been torn from their parents and marked for study were given more food than others, sometimes even candy, to keep them docile. Some remembered how Mengele would greet them with a smile, pat their heads, and hand them sweets as though he were a benevolent uncle. To a starving child, such gestures could be confusing. Why would this man show kindness when he had condemned their family to death? That false gentleness was one of his most insidious weapons. The experiments themselves revealed the monstrous reality behind the facade. Twins were injected with substances to see if one would react differently from the other. Blood transfusions were forced between siblings. Infections were introduced deliberately, wounds inflicted purposefully. Also, Mengele could compare how 2 genetically similar bodies responded. Many did not survive, and those who did were often left scarred, crippled, or blind. One survivor remembered how her twin brother was suddenly taken away for a procedure. Days later, he was returned, lifeless, his body dissected for analysis. She was told coldly that her own survival would provide valuable comparison. To Mengele, these were not children with names, laughter, and futures. They were data points. The barracks echoed with whispered prayers, muffled cries, and the silent endurance of thousands who fought to remain human in a place that denied their humanity. At night, children would curl against one another, trying to find comfort in the closeness of another small body. Mothers, when allowed near their children, sang lullabies too soft to attract the guards' attention. Even in such darkness, the instinct to protect, to nurture, refused to die. But within the twisted structure of Auschwitz, survival was often a matter of chance. A cough too loud, a body too weak, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could mean selection. The barracks were not just shelters, they were waiting rooms for death or for something worse, experimentation. Mengele's presence became a source of constant terror. Prisoners described how the sound of his boots on the wooden floors brought silence and dread. He would stride in, clipboard in hand, scanning the rows of bunks. A gesture of his finger could separate a pair of siblings, mark someone for an injection, or consign a frail body to the crematorium. His selections appeared arbitrary, yet they were always driven by his cold curiosity. The barracks were a microcosm of the camp itself, an environment designed to strip away identity and replace it with numbers tattooed on arms. And yet, even in this place, fragments of humanity persisted. Secretly, people shared scraps of bread. A prisoner with medical training risked his life to treat a sick bunkmate with stolen bandages. These acts of solidarity were sparks in the overwhelming night of cruelty. Still, for those who lived under Mengele's gaze, hope was fragile. They knew that the man who smiled at them in the morning could send them to the dissecting table by evening. The very idea of safety was inverted. The better conditions offered to some were not a gift, but a trap. In the suffocating stillness of the barracks, the prisoners clung to whatever gave them strength, faith, friendship, memory. For the twins especially, holding on to each other was both a comfort and a curse. Their bond was the reason they had been spared at the ramp, and yet that same bond made them targets of unspeakable suffering. The wooden walls of those barracks bore silent witness to countless tragedies. For some, they were the last place they ever saw before vanishing into the machinery of death. For others, they were the backdrop to a struggle for survival that seemed endless. And at the center of it all stood Josef Mengele, a man in a doctor's coat who wielded life and death with a flick of his hand, masking horror beneath the appearance of science. The railway ramp at Auschwitz was the stage on which life and death were decided in seconds. Long trains arrived daily, carrying thousands of deported men, women, and children from across occupied Europe. The doors of the cattle cars would slide open, and chaos spilled onto the tracks. Families staggered out after days without food, water, or air. Infants cried weakly in their mother's arms, the elderly stumbled, and the young clung desperately to their parents' hands. Standing on the platform were the SS officers, their eyes scanning the crowd. Among them was Josef Mengele, impeccably dressed in his officer's uniform, polished boots reflecting the sunlight, his posture confident. He did not bark orders or brandish a whip. Instead, he stood with a calm authority, his right hand gloved, his left often holding a clipboard. To the prisoners, his mere presence was paralyzing. The infamous gesture of his finger became a symbol of terror. With a simple motion, left or right, he decided who would live a little longer and who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers. To the left, the elderly, the sick, the weak, mothers carrying babies. To the right, those deemed strong enough to work, or children who caught his particular interest for his studies. For many, this small wave of the hand was their final judgment. Survivors often recalled the silence that followed the initial chaos. After days of noise inside the trains, the ramp was eerily quiet, broken only by barking dogs and shouted commands in German. It was as though people understood instinctively that their fates were being sealed in that moment. Some tried to stand taller, to look stronger, hoping to avoid detection. Others whispered prayers, clutching hands tighter, wishing they could vanish into the crowd. Mengele's demeanor was deceptive. Witnesses described him as almost charming, even polite. He sometimes greeted new arrivals with a smile, as if welcoming guests rather than condemning them. He would ask questions in a soft tone. How old are you? Are you healthy? What is your profession? And then, without hesitation, direct them left or right. That mask of civility was part of his cruelty. For those moments, he appeared rational, scientific, even kind. Yet every decision was a death sentence disguised as medical assessment. The ramp itself became a theater of the grotesque. Mothers tried desperately to hold on to their children, but SS officers ripped them apart, sending the little ones to one line and the mothers to another. Husbands and wives shouted each other's names as they were pushed in opposite directions. The air was filled with cries of confusion, but the decisions were swift, efficient, merciless. For Mengele, the ramp was not only about separation for labor and extermination. It was also his hunting ground for specimens. He sought out twins with meticulous attention. Survivors recalled how he would walk through the crowds, scanning faces carefully. When he spotted siblings who resembled one another, he lit up with interest. Zwilling, twins, he would shout, and immediately they would be pulled aside. Sometimes he personally escorted them, placing a protective arm around them as though they were chosen for salvation. The twins, often relieved to be spared, could not yet know what awaited them. The cruelty of these selections lay not only in their outcome, but in their speed. In less than 5 minutes, entire families that had survived together for generations were destroyed. A grandmother sent left, her grandchildren sent right. A father pulled to the labor line, his wife and baby to the gas. Survivors later spoke of the unbearable sound of separation. The final words shouted across the platform, the cries of children calling for parents they would never see again. What made Mengele's presence so terrifying was not only the death he represented, but the unpredictability of his choices. Unlike other officers, he sometimes spared those who appeared too young or too weak if they interested him. A child with striking features, a dwarf, or someone with a physical abnormality could suddenly be plucked from the condemned and given a chance to live, if one could call what awaited them living. This randomness gave false hope to some and deepened the horror for others. The ramp became etched in memory as a place of irreversible endings. Survivors described it as the last time they ever saw their parents, their siblings, their homes. They stepped onto those train tracks as families and, within moments, were reduced to scattered individuals, broken apart forever. Yet within the silence and despair, there were flashes of defiance. Some prisoners tried to resist, though resistance was almost impossible against armed guards and dogs. A few chose to run, knowing it meant certain death, but unwilling to submit. Others whispered to their children to be brave, to remember their names, to carry the memory of family no matter what happened. These fragments of courage stood in stark contrast to the calculated efficiency of Mengele's selections. What lingered longest for survivors was not only the separation, but Mengele's face, calm, collected, even pleasant, while deciding the fates of thousands. The contradiction between his appearance and his actions created a chilling impression. A man who could embody civility while orchestrating death. The ramp of Auschwitz was more than a physical place. It became a symbol of the cruelty of the camp itself, where human life was measured in seconds, where mercy was an illusion, and where one man's flick of the wrist decided whether someone breathed another day or vanished into smoke. Beyond the railway ramp lay a world hidden from the new arrivals. Most never knew what took place behind certain locked doors, where medical coats and surgical instruments concealed something darker than any nightmare. Inside those barracks, Josef Mengele conducted the experiments that would etch his name forever into the annals of infamy. For the twins he selected from the ramp, their ordeal began with a strange form of privilege. They were given extra food, better clothing, and often separated from the brutal conditions of regular prisoners. To starving eyes, it almost looked like favoritism. Some children even felt a momentary relief, thinking they had been spared the fate of the gas chambers. They were told they were special, part of an important scientific study. But this illusion was short-lived. The twins were housed together in special barracks, often filled with children from across Europe, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Greece. Survivors described rows of small beds where the young ones clung to each other for comfort. They lived in constant fear because at any moment, guards would call their numbers and they would be led to Mengele's laboratory. The experiments began with measurements. Every detail of their bodies was recorded: height, weight, head circumference, eye color, even the shape of ears and noses. Photographs were taken from every angle. The data was meticulously logged, as though documenting livestock rather than children. Then came blood samples, vials taken regularly, leaving some children weak and pale. But the procedures went far beyond observation. Mengele's obsession with twins was rooted in his desire to unlock the secrets of heredity. If one twin died during an experiment, the other would often be killed so their bodies could be compared side by side. Autopsies followed, dissecting every organ, searching for patterns that might reveal the mysteries of genetics. Witnesses recalled injections whose contents were never explained. Sometimes it was dye injected into the eyes, an attempt to change their color to blue. Children screamed as the burning liquid seared their vision, leaving some blinded for life. Others were injected with unknown substances that caused high fevers, rashes, or death within days. No explanations were given, no treatments provided. Operations were performed without anesthesia. Infections spread, wounds festered, and the screams of children echoed through the barracks. Survivors remembered hearing those cries and knowing what it meant. Another child had been taken into the laboratory. When one child begged for mercy, Mengele reportedly smiled and reassured them softly, as if speaking to a frightened patient. His cruelty lay in the calmness with which he inflicted pain. His experiments were not limited to twins. He also targeted dwarfs, people with physical deformities, and those with rare conditions. Entire families of Roma and Jewish prisoners were placed under his supervision, studied as though they were curiosities in a grotesque museum. The Roma children especially remembered his presence, sometimes gentle, almost paternal, only to turn moments later into something terrifying when the experiments began. The children gave him nicknames. Some called him Uncle Mengele because he greeted them with a smile, handed out sweets, or stroked their hair before leading them into the laboratory. This duality, the mask of kindness hiding unimaginable brutality, made the trauma even deeper. In the mind of a child, he seemed both protector and executioner. Mengele's pursuit of medical knowledge extended to infectious diseases. Prisoners were deliberately injected with typhus, tuberculosis, and other deadly illnesses. Control groups were denied treatment, while others were given experimental drugs. The results were almost always fatal. Those who survived became living evidence of his experiments, scarred both physically and mentally. Yet behind this cruelty was not genuine science. His notes rarely followed proper methodology, and many of his so-called findings were useless. Other Nazi doctors dismissed his work as unprofessional, more fantasy than research. But in Auschwitz, science did not need peer review. It required only power and victims. Survivors who lived through his experiments carried the scars for life. Some lost limbs, others their eyesight, others the ability to bear children. The psychological scars were just as deep. Many testified after the war that even decades later, they could still hear his voice, see his smile, and feel the coldness of his examinations. The cruelty lay not just in what was done, but in the deliberate stripping away of humanity. The children were treated like objects, numbers tattooed on their arms, data points in a notebook. The idea that their pain, their deaths, were simply research material left survivors with a lifelong sense of betrayal by the very profession that should have healed them. For the adults forced to assist him, Jewish doctors, nurses, and orderlies, survival came with unbearable moral weight. They were ordered to carry out tasks under threat of death, drawing blood, holding children still, cleaning instruments. After the war, many described the torment of their complicity. They had no choice, yet they bore witness to every atrocity. In the sterile rooms of Auschwitz, Mengele transformed medicine into an instrument of torture. The white coats, the surgical tools, the smell of disinfectant, all the trappings of healing, were twisted into symbols of despair. He blurred the line between doctor and executioner, between research and murder. Those who survived never forgot the paradox. The man who appeared handsome, educated, polite, even gentle, using all those qualities to conceal the darkest of crimes. For the children, the memory was frozen in time. The day they were taken from the ramp, told they were special, and delivered into the laboratory where innocence ended and horror began. Auschwitz was a place where silence could mean survival, but whispers traveled faster than guards could patrol. Among prisoners, stories about Josef Mengele spread like shadows. Most had never seen the inside of his laboratory, yet almost everyone knew of its horrors. For many, it began with the sight of children disappearing into certain barracks, never to return the same. Those who had witnessed his selections on the ramp would warn newcomers. If he points at you, don't look him in the eye. Don't stand out. Don't let him notice your children. It was impossible advice, of course. The doctor's gaze seemed to cut through the crowd, searching for twins, the young, or anyone unusual. Mothers gripped their children tighter, hoping to shield them. But in that world of power and fear, resistance often meant nothing. Inside the camp, prisoners shared fragments of knowledge. They spoke of needles filled with burning liquids, of children whose eyes changed color overnight, of fevers that spread from deliberate injections. The stories were passed quietly, at night in the barracks, when the guards were gone and only the faint glow of lamps illuminated the room. These stories were terrifying, yet they also served as warnings. Stay invisible, stay quiet, don't attract attention. The psychological impact was immense. Even for those who were never chosen, the possibility loomed over every day. Parents prayed their children would look ordinary, unremarkable, nothing that might catch Mengele's interest. Some even tried to disguise their twins, dressing them differently or keeping them apart, though often it was useless. The doctor had a talent for spotting them, as if he could sense their bond at a glance. Prisoners began to live with a dual fear, the gas chambers on one side, the experiments on the other. Both meant death, but one promised suffering first. Survivors described the dread of hearing their names or numbers called for the doctor's research. It was like waiting for execution, only slower, with more uncertainty. And yet, even in this environment of terror, whispers of resistance emerged. Jewish doctors and nurses forced to assist Mengele sometimes tried to ease the suffering in small ways. They hid information, lied about test results, or gave children small comforts, an extra piece of bread, a soft word. Knowing these gestures could be the only humanity those children experienced. There were also prisoners who risked their lives to pass on what they saw. Some managed to smuggle notes or drawings of the experiments to the outside world, hidden in scraps of clothing or buried in the ground. Others whispered their testimonies to fellow inmates, ensuring that even if they died, someone else would remember. But speaking carried dangers. Informers were everywhere, and a careless word could lead to punishment or death. Still, the stories persisted. They became part of the fabric of camp life, warnings stitched into the collective memory of the prisoners. For many, the greatest torment was not knowing the truth. Rumors blended with reality, and the imagination filled in the gaps. One survivor recalled that even the sound of a child crying in the distance could trigger panic. We knew it meant another experiment. Sometimes we didn't know what was worse, the truth or what we imagined. The psychological games played by Mengele added to this fear. He sometimes appeared at the children's barracks smiling, offering candy or toys, creating confusion about his intentions. This deliberate cruelty, offering kindness before pain, deepened the trauma. Prisoners whispered about these contradictions. The doctor who smiled like a friend, then killed like an enemy. Over time, the name Mengele became a specter in Auschwitz. Parents used it like a warning, whispering to children, "Stay still. Be quiet. If you misbehave, the doctor will come." It was a twisted form of discipline born from terror, but it reflected how his shadow dominated every corner of camp life. Even those who never saw his face knew his reputation. His experiments became camp legend, blending fact with rumor, horror with myth. Some said he was searching for immortality, others that he wanted to create a master race of identical children. None of it mattered to the victims. All they knew was that once you entered his laboratory, you were unlikely to return whole. The whispers also carried an undercurrent of resilience. By sharing stories, prisoners preserved the truth. They refused to let the suffering disappear into silence. Even when it meant risking their own lives, they spoke to one another, reminding each other that what was happening was real, that they were not imagining it. In a place designed to erase humanity, the act of remembering became resistance. The rumors seeped beyond Auschwitz as well. Escaped prisoners carried tales of Mengele's experiments to the outside world, though many found it hard to believe. The sheer cruelty defied imagination. Still, within the barbed wire fences, every child, every mother, every twin knew the reality. His name was a death sentence whispered in the dark. For those who survived, the memory of those whispers remained. Decades later, survivors described how fear could spread without a word, how one look, one gesture, one rumor in the night could send waves of terror through hundreds of people. Auschwitz was not just a place of physical torment. It was a place where the human mind was broken, reshaped by constant fear, rumor, and the haunting presence of a doctor who turned science into a weapon. Hope inside Auschwitz was fragile, like a candle struggling to stay lit in a storm. And yet, even in the darkest corners, it refused to be extinguished. Among the barracks, survivors recalled moments of extraordinary resilience, especially among the children. Those who, despite unimaginable suffering, found ways to cling to life. Prisoners described how children sometimes played games with scraps of wood or bits of string, pretending for a few minutes that the world outside still existed. For them, laughter became an act of rebellion. Every giggle was defiance against the system designed to silence them. Some remembered songs whispered quietly at night, lullabies passed down from mothers to calm, trembling bodies. These moments of tenderness, though fleeting, offered reminders that humanity had not yet been erased. Even among those chosen for Josef Mengele's experiments, there were sparks of resilience. Survivors spoke of twins who held hands tightly as they were led into laboratories, refusing to let go even when surrounded by fear. They found comfort in each other, drawing strength from a bond no amount of cruelty could fully destroy. A smile, a whispered word, a shared piece of bread. These were small gestures, but they carried immense meaning. Prison doctors forced to assist Mengele sometimes tried to help in secret. One survivor recounted how a Jewish doctor risked his own life by injecting water instead of deadly chemicals into a child's veins. Another smuggled medicine, stolen from German supplies, to ease the suffering of the sick. These acts of quiet defiance rarely changed the outcome, but they gave the victims something even more powerful: the knowledge that someone cared. Faith, too, became a source of strength. Some prisoners recited prayers under their breath, even when forbidden. Others told stories of their lives before the camp, reminding themselves and others that they had once been more than numbers, more than experiments. A mother might describe her home, her garden, her village, allowing her child to dream of something beyond the fences. These visions of normal life became lifelines, fragile yet essential. There were also moments of extraordinary courage. In rare cases, prisoners sabotaged experiments from within. A nurse might swap records, rendering data useless. An assistant might delay an injection, giving a child a chance to recover or at least to suffer less. These quiet acts of resistance were rarely acknowledged, but they represented a profound refusal to surrender completely to cruelty. For many children, imagination itself became a form of survival. One survivor remembered how, during long nights in the barracks, she and her sister would whisper about magical lands where no one was hungry and no doctors with cold eyes existed. Their fantasy worlds gave them a sense of control, however fleeting, in a place where everything else was taken. Even the simple act of remembering names was an act of defiance. Mengele reduced people to subjects and numbers, but prisoners whispered names in the dark, keeping them alive. "Don't forget who you are," parents told their children. "Say your name to yourself every day." It was a reminder that their identities mattered, that they were more than entries in a twisted experiment. The contradictions of life in Auschwitz made hope both dangerous and necessary. On one hand, too much hope could lead to devastating disappointment. On the other, without it, survival itself became impossible. Survivors often recalled living in a delicate balance between despair and determination. They did not always believe they would make it, but they clung to the possibility, because to give up entirely was to die before death came. Children especially embodied this paradox. They were the most vulnerable, yet sometimes the most resilient. One story tells of a boy who, even after enduring injections that left him weak and feverish, managed to smile at his twin sister and whisper, "We're still together." For the prisoners around him, that smile became a symbol, a reminder that even in a place designed to crush the human spirit, the spark of life endured. These fragments of hope did not erase the horrors of the camp, but they softened them. They gave survivors memories not only of pain, but also of courage, compassion, and resilience. Years later, when recounting their experiences, many survivors said that those small moments, songs, prayers, laughter, were what allowed them to endure. In the broader sense, these fragments were acts of resistance. Every song sung, every prayer whispered, every smile exchanged was a refusal to let Auschwitz claim total victory. The Nazis could control bodies, but not always hearts. And in that refusal, humanity persisted. The contradictions haunted survivors long after liberation. They remembered the fear, but also the fleeting joys. They remembered the cruelty of the doctor, but also the kindness of a nurse who risked everything. They remembered the screams, but also the songs. These paradoxes defined their survival, shaping memories that would follow them forever. In the end, the fragments of hope inside Auschwitz were like shards of glass scattered across a ruined floor, small, fragile, often painful to hold. But they reflected something vital, the refusal of the human spirit to surrender entirely, even in the face of unspeakable darkness. While life inside Auschwitz was defined by fear and fragments of hope, beyond the barbed wire a different story was unfolding. The outside world was not completely ignorant of what was happening. Whispers carried by escaping prisoners, coded messages smuggled through underground networks, and intercepted reports all pointed to unspeakable crimes. Yet, disbelief often dulled the urgency. For those who lived in nearby towns and villages, rumors about the camp were unavoidable. Residents saw the smoke, smelled the strange stench, and watched trains full of people go in, but never come out. Some tried to dismiss it as war propaganda, unable to reconcile the idea of industrial-scale cruelty with their sense of normal life. Others knew more than they admitted, but silence felt safer than acknowledgement. The Allies, too, began receiving reports as early as 1942. Members of the Polish resistance documented what they had seen and sent messages to London. Jewish organizations desperately tried to raise alarm about mass deportations and killings. Still, many leaders hesitated to act. To them, the details sounded too monstrous to be true. A doctor tearing apart twins? Children injected with unknown substances? It defied belief. When stories of Josef Mengele's experiments began to surface, they spread like shadows, disturbing, uncertain, easy to dismiss as exaggerations. Survivors who managed to escape spoke of a young SS doctor with piercing eyes who treated the camp like his laboratory. They described children lined up for inspection, their fates decided with a flick of his wrist. Some messengers carried scraps of testimony, fragments of medical notes, and whispered accounts of injections and dissections. But without photographs, without undeniable evidence, the full horror remained hidden. Inside neutral countries, newspapers occasionally published hints of the atrocities. Readers scanned the articles with shock, but also with skepticism. How could a civilized nation, with universities, doctors, and scientists, commit such acts? For many, it was easier to believe that the reports were exaggerated or fabricated than to confront the reality. The Red Cross, invited by the Nazis to inspect certain camps, was carefully deceived. They were shown model barracks, staged conditions, and prisoners selected to appear healthy. The inspectors reported what they saw, unaware that they had been manipulated. Meanwhile, trains to Auschwitz continued to arrive daily, unloading thousands to their deaths or into Mengele's experiments. For those trapped inside the camp, the idea that the outside world might not believe them was a heavy burden. Survivors later recalled thinking, "If we ever get out, no one will believe us." That fear became part of the trauma, knowing that their suffering might be dismissed as unimaginable fantasy. And yet, fragments of truth managed to escape. Two men, Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler, famously broke out of Auschwitz in 1944. They carried with them detailed reports of mass killings, including the existence of gas chambers and medical experiments. Their testimony reached Allied leaders and even the Vatican. It was one of the first documents to describe the camp's operations with undeniable clarity. Even then, the response was hesitant. Political leaders debated priorities. Was bombing the railways leading to Auschwitz worth the risk of civilian casualties? Should resources be diverted from the broader war effort to target a single camp? For those suffering inside, these debates were a cruel reminder of how distant their plight seemed to the outside world. Mengele's name began to circulate in resistance networks. He was referred to as the Angel of Death, though some whispered it with more accuracy as the devil in disguise. His obsession with twins became one of the most notorious aspects of his work. Stories of children with identical faces, paraded like rare specimens, horrified anyone who heard them. Still, without visual proof, many dismissed the reports as wartime exaggeration. In the villages surrounding Auschwitz, local populations sometimes tried to help in small ways. Farmers left scraps of food near the fences, knowing desperate hands might reach for them. Resistance groups organized secret efforts to sabotage transport lines or spread information about the camp. But for the most part, fear ruled. Speaking too loudly, asking too many questions, or showing too much sympathy could result in death. Silence became its own form of survival. These whispers beyond the fence, scattered and fragmented, were the first cracks in the wall of secrecy that the Nazis had built around Auschwitz. They revealed both the resilience of those who tried to tell the truth and the reluctance of a world unprepared to face such horror. For the prisoners inside, hope sometimes rested on the belief that someone, somewhere, would hear their cries. That belief, fragile as it was, helped them endure. But the bitter truth was this: even when the world began to listen, it did not move fast enough to stop the nightmare. By 1944, the tide of war had shifted. The Red Army was advancing from the east, Allied forces had landed in Normandy, and the once invincible Nazi Empire was crumbling. Inside Auschwitz, however, time seemed frozen in terror. The smoke still rose from the chimneys, the trains still arrived full, and Josef Mengele still prowled the camp with his clipboard and calm demeanor, as though the outside world did not exist. But in subtle ways, the pressure of the approaching defeat began to show. The Nazis, aware that the walls were closing in, grew more desperate. Evidence of their crimes had to be hidden, destroyed, erased. Entire records were burned, buildings demolished, bodies exhumed, and incinerated in an attempt to conceal the magnitude of their atrocities. Mengele, however, seemed undeterred by the impending collapse. If anything, survivors recalled, he became even more obsessive. His selection of twins increased, his notes grew longer, and his experiments became more extreme. To him, the war outside was an abstraction. What mattered was the work, the twisted vision of science he believed would outlive the Reich. In those final years, the camp grew more chaotic. Overcrowding reached unbearable levels as prisoners from other camps were forced into Auschwitz to avoid advancing Soviet forces. Diseases spread rapidly, supplies dwindled, and yet Mengele's laboratory never slowed. Some described how he used this chaos to test broader experiments, injecting chemicals into prisoners to study survival, exposing them to untreated diseases, or attempting surgical procedures without anesthesia. Witnesses remembered his cold efficiency. He could step from a selection line, where he decided who would live or die with a flick of his wrist, straight into the laboratory, where he meticulously recorded measurements of skulls, limbs, and organs. For him, the camp had become a single system, a machine that fed his insatiable hunger for data. Outside, the Allies were beginning to piece together a clearer picture of what was happening. Reports from the Verba, Wetzlar escape circulated. Photographs of mass graves taken by advancing armies in Eastern Europe confirmed the unimaginable. Auschwitz was no longer just a rumor, it was a reality. But as the evidence mounted, so too did Mengele's urgency. He worked as though racing against the clock, determined to leave behind a body of research that would make him indispensable even after the Reich's collapse. His colleagues noticed this determination. Some SS officers mocked his fixation, whispering that while the Reich was burning, he was still chasing twins. But others saw opportunity. If the war ended badly, perhaps his data could serve as a bargaining chip, proof of scientific value that might buy his survival. Whether or not Mengele consciously believed this, his actions suggest that he was preparing for a world beyond Nazi defeat. Survivors recalled his chilling words. On more than one occasion, he reportedly told prisoners, "History will remember my work." For the children under his care, this was not reassurance, it was a threat. He believed his legacy would outlast them, even if their lives were extinguished in his pursuit of knowledge. As the Soviet army pressed closer in late 1944, the Nazis initiated frantic evacuations. Known as death marches, thousands of prisoners were forced to march westward through the freezing cold, often without food, water, or proper clothing. Anyone who stumbled was shot. Auschwitz itself was partially emptied, though not before tens of thousands remained behind. Mengele, however, was not among the prisoners. He vanished into the chaos, leaving little trace of his whereabouts as the camp's liberation approached. His escape was not a panicked flight, but a carefully calculated move. With falsified papers and the help of loyal networks, he blended into the disintegrating Nazi infrastructure. For the prisoners, his disappearance was surreal. One day, he was there, gliding through the camp with his immaculate uniform and polished boots. The next, he was gone, leaving behind broken bodies, unfinished notes, and a reputation that was already legend in the darkest sense. When Soviet soldiers finally liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, they found mountains of evidence. Piles of clothing, warehouses filled with hair, spectacles, shoes, children's toys. They found medical equipment and documents that hinted at experiments too cruel to comprehend. But Mengele himself had slipped away, like a ghost fading into the wreckage of a collapsing empire. For survivors, liberation was both salvation and agony. They were free, but scarred, their bodies marked and their minds haunted by memories of the angel of death. Some tried to explain what they had seen. Needles pushed into children's eyes, surgeries performed without anesthesia, drawings of twins cataloged like specimens. Many could barely speak the words, and those who listened struggled to believe. The war was ending, but for Josef Mengele, the story was far from over. His crimes had been exposed, but he was not in custody. While other Nazi doctors faced trials at Nuremberg, Mengele was already plotting his escape into anonymity. The world would soon learn that the liberation of Auschwitz was not the end of his tale, but the beginning of a long, elusive shadow. In the aftermath of Auschwitz's liberation, the world demanded justice. The Nuremberg trials were prepared, gathering testimony, documents, and photographic evidence that laid bare the crimes of the Nazi regime. Doctors who had participated in human experiments stood accused, their fates sealed by mountains of evidence. But one name was conspicuously absent from the courtroom: Josef Mengele. While his colleagues faced the judgment of the world, Mengele was already weaving himself into the shadows. His ability to vanish was not mere luck. It was the result of planning, connections, and the chaos of a collapsing empire. In early 1945, Mengele disguised himself as an ordinary soldier, discarding his SS insignia. With false papers under the name Fritz Hallmann, he blended among thousands of retreating Germans. His appearance, neat, aristocratic, ironically helped him. In a world flooded with refugees, soldiers, and broken civilians, he looked like a man who belonged. At one point, he was even captured by American forces. His name appeared on a list of wanted war criminals, but due to bureaucratic errors and the sheer volume of prisoners, his identity slipped through the cracks. The man who had sent thousands to their deaths at Auschwitz walked out of captivity unrecognized, free to disappear. For the next several years, Mengele lived a shadowed existence in Germany. He worked as a farmhand, moved between safe houses, and relied on loyal networks of former Nazis and sympathizers who provided shelter. During these years, he developed a reputation as a man who was always just beyond reach. Allied investigators hunted him, but their efforts were slowed by the destruction of post-war Europe and the prioritization of rebuilding nations. By 1949, Mengele decided Germany was too dangerous. The Nuremberg doctors' trial had sentenced several of his colleagues to death, and his name had surfaced repeatedly in survivor testimonies. If discovered, he would almost certainly hang. Escape was no longer a luxury, it was a necessity. He turned to the notorious Ratlins, clandestine escape networks organized by former Nazis and sympathetic clergy. These routes funneled war criminals from Europe to South America, a continent where sympathetic governments and weak extradition treaties provided safe haven. In 1949, using a Red Cross passport under the name Helmut Greger, Mengele boarded a ship bound for Argentina. He stepped on his South American soil not as the angel of death, but as a man reborn under a new identity. Buenos Aires was a city teeming with German immigrants, both innocent refugees and darker figures of the Reich who had found refuge there. In this bustling metropolis, Mengele melted into the community. He found work as a carpenter, then as a sales representative for a pharmaceutical company. He lived modestly but safely, shielded by money his family continued to send from Germany and by the silence of those who knew who he truly was. The irony was stark. In Europe, survivors were giving testimony about the horrors of Auschwitz, while in Argentina, the man responsible was sipping coffee in sidewalk cafes, blending seamlessly with ordinary citizens. In the 1950s, as West Germany stabilized, international pressure mounted to hunt down Nazi fugitives. The newly formed State of Israel, through its intelligence agency Mossad, began tracking war criminals with relentless determination. Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, was captured in Buenos Aires in 1960 and smuggled to Israel for trial. His capture shocked the world and sent waves of fear through fugitives like Mengele. For Mengele, Eichmann's capture was a warning. He fled Buenos Aires, moving to Paraguay, where dictator Alfredo Stroessner's regime offered protection to former Nazis. From there, he traveled to Brazil, always shifting, always hiding. He lived under false names, moving between rural farms and isolated towns, leaving behind only whispers of his presence. Throughout these years, survivors of Auschwitz never stopped speaking his name. They testified to his cruelty, his experiments, his selections. Books were written, films produced, and yet Josef Mengele remained a ghost, visible only in the memories of those who had endured him. The world knew he was alive. His name was added to most wanted lists. West Germany issued arrest warrants. Mossad considered operations to capture him, but Mengele was slippery. He rarely stayed in one place long, avoided large cities, and trusted only a tight circle of protectors. He lived not as a prisoner of bars, but as a prisoner of fear. Constantly watching his back, avoiding cameras, never sure if a knock on the door would be the end. Yet he survived, year after year, decade after decade, while justice remained out of reach. By the 1970s, Mengele had become almost mythic. Newspapers speculated about his whereabouts. Some claimed he had died. Others swore they had seen him in Paraguay, Chile, even Egypt. Each rumor reignited outrage. Each false lead frustrated those who demanded accountability. But the truth was stranger than fiction. The angel of death lived quietly on the outskirts of São Paulo, Brazil, under the protection of a family of sympathizers. He worked on farms, studied medicine privately, and even attended social gatherings with German émigrés who knew his past and kept his secret. While the world condemned him, Mengele seemed to believe he had escaped justice for good. He once boasted in a letter that history would vindicate his work and that his scientific contributions would eventually be recognized. For the survivors, those words were like salt in the wound. They carried their trauma into old age, waiting for a justice that seemed forever out of reach, haunted by the memory of a man who had played God with their lives, and then walked away into the sunlight of South America. The ocean was calm that day, waves gently breaking against the Brazilian shore. Josef Mengele, an old man now, gray, frail, a shadow of his former self, walked into the water. For decades, he had lived under false names, hiding in plain sight, dining at Brazilian cafes, chatting with neighbors who never knew the monster in their midst. And then, without ceremony, his heart gave out. He collapsed into the surf, swallowed by the sea. The man who had once played God with human lives died like any other mortal, alone, gasping, irrelevant. It was not justice. It was not enough. No trial. No final reckoning. Only a death certificate in a foreign land and whispers among neighbors who barely remembered his name. While survivors carried scars that never healed, while families wept for generations lost, Josef Mengele's final chapter ended not with a courtroom gavel, but with a coroner's report. When news broke in 1979 that Mengele had drowned, the world struggled with disbelief. For years, intelligence agencies, Nazi hunters, and survivors had pursued him. There were countless rumors: Mengele in Paraguay, Mengele in Argentina, Mengele hiding in Europe. To hear that he had simply died of a stroke while swimming in Brazil was anticlimactic, almost insulting. But forensic evidence later confirmed it. The man buried under a simple gravestone was indeed the angel of death. And yet, death did not silence the questions. How had he escaped justice for so long? How had a man responsible for the murder and mutilation of thousands slipped past the grasp of the world's most powerful governments? The answer was a cocktail of luck, corruption, and complicity. Networks of former Nazis helped him flee. Sympathizers provided him with money, documents, safe houses. And the world's attention, shifting to new wars and new enemies, allowed him to fade into the background. But history has a way of leaving marks that even death cannot erase. Mengele's name became synonymous with evil, with the perverse blending of medicine and murder, science and sadism. For survivors, his death brought no closure. There was no chance to confront him in a courtroom, no opportunity to hear him condemned by law as he had been condemned by conscience. Justice was stolen from them, just as he had stolen so many lives in Auschwitz. And yet, perhaps the greater punishment was obscurity. The man who craved control, who strutted through Auschwitz like a self-made god, died as a fugitive nobody. His remains were exhumed years later, studied like an artifact, a body stripped of dignity, just as he had stripped so many of theirs. His story, once hidden, was laid bare, and the world has never let go of the lesson. Today, when his name is spoken, it is not with reverence, but with revulsion. He is remembered not as a doctor, not as a man of science, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when ideology erases humanity. His legacy is a scar etched into human memory, a reminder that progress without morality leads to horror. And this is where history speaks directly to us. Evil rarely looks like a monster at first. It often wears a smile, hides behind uniforms, credentials, and promises of a greater good. Josef Mengele was not born with a knife in his hand. He chose it. He chose cruelty. He chose to see human beings as experiments, as objects, as expendable. That choice made him powerful in the moment, but despised for eternity. As the waves of Brazil closed over him, there was no one to remember him kindly. Only ghosts, only victims, only generations determined to never let his crimes fade into silence. His final disgrace was not his death. It was that the world remembers him for what he truly was: a coward, a murderer, and a symbol of the darkest depths humanity can reach. And so his story ends, not with redemption, not with honor, but with a drowning man swallowed by the same world he tried to dominate. Justice may not have been served in life, but history ensures that his name lives forever, not in glory, but in infamy.